They laughed at the old hatted man, not knowing he was the one giving all the orders. The autumn rain drummed against the grimy windows of Murphy's Tavern, casting dancing shadows across the smoke-filled room. In the corner booth, beneath a flickering gas lamp, sat a man whose weathered face bore the lines of 60 hard years. His name was Thomas "Old Tom" McKenna, and to the casual observer, he appeared to be nothing more than another forgotten soul nursing his whiskey in Chicago's South Side. The year was 1925, and Prohibition had turned the city into a battlefield where fortunes were made and lost in the space of a gunshot. Young men in sharp suits and polished shoes strutted through the tavern, their voices loud with the arrogance of easy money and easier violence. They glanced at Old Tom with barely concealed contempt, their eyes taking in his worn brown coat, his battered fedora that had seen better decades, and his calloused hands wrapped around a glass of cheap bourbon. "Look at the old-timer," whispered Jimmy Torino, a 25-year-old with slicked-back hair and a gold tooth that caught the lamplight. "He's probably been sitting in that same spot since the war ended." His companion, Vincent "Vinny" Castellano, laughed as he adjusted his silk tie. "My grandfather used to tell stories about guys like that, relics from the old neighborhood, before we learned how to really make money." Old Tom's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his glass, but his expression remained neutral. He'd perfected this mask over 4 decades of navigating Chicago's underworld. Back when these boys were still learning to walk, the city had changed, evolved from the rough-hewn immigrant neighborhoods of his youth into something more sophisticated, more brutal. But power, real power, hadn't changed at all. The tavern door swung open with a violent crash, and 3 men entered with the swagger of those who believed themselves untouchable. At their head walked Mickey Flanagan, a red-haired Irishman whose reputation for cruelty had earned him control of the docks. His eyes swept the room with predatory interest before settling on a nervous-looking man hunched over a table near the back. "Danny Sullivan," Mickey's voice cut through the tavern's chatter like a blade. "You've been avoiding me." Danny, a dock worker with a wife and 3 children, looked up with the expression of a cornered animal. "Mickey, I told you I need more time. The Longshoremen's Union is watching everything these days." "Time's up, Danny boy." Mickey's hand moved to rest on the butt of the pistol beneath his coat. "You either start moving our merchandise through your section of the docks, or we find someone who will." The tavern had gone quiet, the kind of silence that preceded violence. Old Tom watched the scene unfold with the detached interest of someone who had witnessed countless similar moments. He noted the way Mickey's men positioned themselves, blocking the exits. He observed the fear in Danny's eyes, the trembling in his hands. Most importantly, he saw the fundamental mistake Mickey was making. Young men like Mickey believed that fear was power. They thought that the ability to hurt someone, to take their life or livelihood, was what separated the strong from the weak. Old Tom knew better. Real power was invisible, moving through channels these young gangsters couldn't even perceive. "Please, Mickey," Danny's voice cracked. "My little girl, she's been sick. The medical bills. Not my problem." Mickey drew his gun with theatrical flourish, enjoying the gasps from the other patrons. "You see, everyone, this is what happens when you don't honor your commitments." Old Tom stood slowly, his movement deliberate and unhurried. The floorboards creaked under his worn boots as he approached the confrontation. Every eye in the tavern turned to watch this apparent act of suicidal foolishness. "Son," Old Tom's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "You're making a mistake." Mickey spun around, his gun now pointed at Old Tom's chest. "Are you talking to me, old man? You picked a hell of a time to grow a backbone." "Danny Sullivan works for me," Old Tom said simply. "Has for 15 years. And you're in my tavern, threatening my employee." The laughter that erupted from Mickey and his men was genuine, born from disbelief at the old man's audacity. "Your tavern? Your employee?" Mickey's face reddened with amusement. "Listen, Grandpa, why don't you shuffle back to your corner before you get hurt?" Old Tom reached into his coat pocket, his movement so casual that it didn't immediately register as threatening. He withdrew a small leather notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "Vincent Torino," he read aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the silent tavern. "Born 1885, died 1904, knifed outside a gambling den on Halsted Street." Vinny Castellano's face went white. Vincent Torino had been his father. Michael Patrick Flanagan, Old Tom continued, turning a page. Born County Cork, Ireland, 1895. Arrived Ellis Island, 1913. Mother, Mary Flanagan. Deceased, 1918, influenza. Father, Patrick Flanagan. Currently residing at 1247 West Division Street, apartment 3B. Mickey's gun hand began to shake. His father's address wasn't something he'd shared with anyone. You see, boys, Old Tom closed the notebook and returned it to his pocket. I've been keeping records for a very long time. I know where you live, where your families sleep, where you keep your money, and where you bury your mistakes. I know because I've been watching, waiting, and when necessary, deciding who lives and who dies in this city since before you were born. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Mickey's gun remained pointed at Old Tom, but his confidence had evaporated like morning mist. Now, Old Tom's voice remained conversational. Danny Sullivan is going to finish his drink and go home to his sick daughter. You boys are going to walk out of my tavern. And tomorrow morning, Mickey, you're going to send an envelope with $500 to Danny's address. Consider it compensation for the distress you've caused. And if we don't, Mickey's voice had lost its swagger. Old Tom smiled for the first time that evening, and it was a smile that spoke of decades of quiet victories and buried enemies. Then you'll discover why they call me Old Tom instead of Dead Tom. Dawn broke gray and cold over Chicago's industrial district, painting the smokestacks and factory buildings in shades of ash and iron. Old Tom McKenna stood at the window of his modest apartment above a bakery on Taylor Street, watching the city wake up below him. The morning light revealed what the tavern's shadows had hidden. This was not the dwelling of a poor man, despite its humble appearance. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their metal surfaces scarred by decades of use. Maps of Chicago covered one entire wall, marked with colored pins and hand-drawn notations that tracked the ebb and flow of power through the city's neighborhoods. A telegraph machine sat in the corner, its brass fittings polished to a mirror shine, while a telephone, a luxury most couldn't afford, rested on a desk crafted from rich mahogany. Old Tom poured himself coffee from a silver pot and settled into his reading chair. The morning papers were already waiting. The Chicago Tribune, the Daily News, and 3 smaller publications that most citizens never saw. These underground newsletters carried the real news of the city, which politicians had been bought, which judges could be influenced, and which shipping manifests had been altered to hide their true contents. A soft knock interrupted his reading. Come in, Margaret." Margaret O'Brien entered with the quiet efficiency of someone who had worked for the same employer for 20 years. At 55, she retained the sharp beauty of her Irish heritage, though silver now threaded through her auburn hair. She had been Old Tom's secretary, confidant, and the closest thing to family he possessed since his wife's death in the influenza pandemic of 1918. The morning reports, Mr. McKenna. She placed a leather portfolio on the table beside his chair. Flanagan sent the money to the Sullivan family, as you requested. $500, delivered by hand before sunrise. Old Tom nodded, unsurprised. Mickey Flanagan might be young and reckless, but he wasn't stupid. The previous night's demonstration had served its purpose. What about the Castellanos? Vincent's been asking questions all night. Called in favors from New York, trying to learn more about you. Margaret's smile held a hint of amusement. From what I hear, he's not finding the answers he expected. And what answers is he finding? Dead ends, mostly. A few old-timers remember your name, but they're not talking. The younger generation seems to think you died years ago. Old Tom chuckled. It had taken considerable effort and expense to cultivate that particular myth. In a business where reputation meant everything, sometimes the most valuable reputation was no reputation at all. The telephone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the morning quiet. Margaret answered with practiced professionalism. McKenna residence. Yes, he's available. One moment, please. She covered the mouthpiece with her hand. Detective Patrick Morrison, Chicago Police Department. Old Tom accepted the receiver. Patrick, good morning. Tom, we need to talk. Morrison's voice carried the weight of a man who hadn't slept. Something happened last night at Murphy's Tavern. I've got 3 different witnesses telling me Mickey Flanagan backed down from some old man, but nobody wants to give me details. Mickey's a smart boy. Sometimes wisdom comes with age, even borrowed age. Cut the riddles, Tom. I've got pressure from above to investigate anything involving Flanagan. The mayor's breathing down the commissioner's neck about violence in the entertainment district. Old Tom understood the subtext. Mayor William Devers' reform administration was waging a public war against organized crime, while privately negotiating the terms of their coexistence. It was a delicate dance that required careful choreography from all participants. Tell the commissioner that Mr. Flanagan experienced a moment of clarity regarding his business practices. I believe he'll find his future conduct more considerate of public safety. Jesus, Tom. Sometimes I forget how long you've been playing this game. Do you even remember when you weren't pulling strings in this city? The question struck deeper than Morrison intended. Old Tom's mind drifted back to 1885, when he'd arrived in Chicago as Thomas McKenna, a 16-year-old Irish immigrant with nothing but determination and a talent for reading people. The city had been rebuilding from the Great Fire, full of opportunities for a young man willing to work outside conventional boundaries. He'd started small, running messages between gambling houses, keeping watch during clandestine meetings, learning the rhythm of Chicago's hidden economy. By 1890, he was managing a network of informants that stretched from the stockyards to City Hall. By 1900, he was making decisions that affected the lives of thousands of people, though few knew his name. Patrick, Old Tom said finally, everyone starts somewhere. The trick is knowing when to stop climbing and start building. After ending the call, Old Tom turned his attention to the portfolio Margaret had delivered. Inside were reports from his network of contacts, dock workers, telephone operators, bank clerks, and domestic servants who worked in the homes of Chicago's elite. Information flowed to him from 100 different sources, creating a picture of the city's power structure that was more complete than what any single government agency possessed. One report caught his attention immediately. Judge Harrison Blackwood, who presided over most organized crime cases, had received an unexpected visit from federal agents the previous afternoon. They'd spent 3 hours in his chambers, emerging with satisfied expressions and leaving the judge visibly shaken. Old Tom reached for his telephone and dialed a number he'd memorized decades ago. Blackwood residence. Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood. This is Thomas McKenna. Might I speak with the judge? There was a pause, then the sound of hurried footsteps. Judge Blackwood's voice came through the line, tense and worried. Tom, thank God you called. We need to meet. The usual place? No, somewhere more private. The federal building. They know things, Tom, things they shouldn't know. Old Tom felt a familiar cold settling in his chest, the sensation he'd learned to associate with genuine danger. Federal involvement changed everything. Local corruption was manageable, predictable. Federal agents answered to masters in Washington, men who didn't understand the delicate ecosystem that kept Chicago's violence within acceptable bounds. Lincoln Park, by the pond. 1 hour. Tom, I'm scared. If they have evidence, Judge, take a breath. Fear makes people careless, and carelessness gets people killed. We've navigated worse waters than this. After ending the call, Old Tom sat quietly for several minutes, thinking. Change was coming to Chicago, the kind of change that swept away old arrangements and old men who had grown comfortable in their power. He'd survived by adapting, by reading the currents of power and positioning himself accordingly. But this felt different. Margaret appeared in the doorway. Trouble, perhaps, or perhaps opportunity. In 40 years, I've learned they're often the same thing wearing different masks. He stood and retrieved his coat from the closet, the same worn brown coat that had drawn such contempt the night before. Let them think him weak, he reflected. Let them think him old and harmless. It was remarkable how much latitude people gave you when they believed you posed no threat. I'll be back this afternoon, he told Margaret. And if anyone calls, I'm visiting my nephew in Milwaukee. You don't have a nephew in Milwaukee. Old Tom smiled as he settled his battered fedora on his head. I don't have a nephew anywhere, but Milwaukee sounds appropriately boring for an old man's family obligation. As he stepped into the Chicago morning, Old Tom McKenna looked every inch the anonymous retiree he pretended to be. But beneath the humble exterior, his mind was already working, calculating angles and possibilities, preparing for whatever storm the federal government intended to bring to his carefully constructed world. Lincoln Park stretched along Lake Michigan's shoreline like a green ribbon, offering respite from Chicago's industrial sprawl. Old Tom arrived 15 minutes early, settling onto a bench that provided clear sightlines in all directions. The morning joggers and mothers with perambulators created perfect cover for a clandestine meeting, their innocent presence discouraging surveillance from any interested parties. Judge Harrison Blackwood approached with the measured steps of a man carrying an enormous burden. At 62, he possessed the dignified bearing expected of his position, but old Tom's experienced eye noted the telltale signs of stress, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted constantly to nearby faces, the perspiration that had nothing to do with the cool October air. "Tom, thank you for coming." Blackwood sat heavily beside him, his voice barely above a whisper. "Start from the beginning, Harrison. What did the federal agents want? They knew about the Torino verdict. They knew I'd taken money to reduce Vincent's father's sentence back in 1903. They had photographs. Tom, photographs of me meeting with your predecessor, Michael O'Sullivan." Old Tom felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lake breeze. Michael O'Sullivan had been his mentor in the early days, the man who'd taught him that power in Chicago flowed through channels invisible to casual observers. O'Sullivan had died in 1910, taking most of his secrets to the grave. Or so old Tom had believed. What else did they have? Financial records, bank statements showing deposits that coincided with favorable verdicts. They'd traced the money through 3 different accounts. Blackwood's voice cracked. "My God, Tom, they've been investigating this for years. How did we not know?" Old Tom studied the lake's gray surface while his mind processed this information. Federal investigators with multi-year operations and photographic evidence suggested resources far beyond anything he'd anticipated. Someone with significant authority had decided to dismantle Chicago's traditional power structure. "What do they want from you?" "Cooperation. They want me to record conversations, gather evidence on active operations. They particularly mentioned Mickey Flanagan and the dock situation. And in exchange, immunity for my past. Indiscretions. A chance to retire quietly next year instead of spending my remaining years in federal prison." Old Tom nodded thoughtfully. The federal strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Turn the infrastructure of corruption against itself. With Judge Blackwood as an informant, they could build cases against every major player in Chicago's underworld. "Harrison, I need you to understand something. The moment you start recording conversations for federal agents, you become the most dangerous man in Chicago, not because of what you might discover, but because of what people will assume you've already told them. Are you saying I should refuse? I'm saying you should be very careful about the promises federal agents make. They see Chicago as a temporary assignment. Once they've collected their evidence and prosecutions, they'll return to Washington. You'll still be here, living with the consequences of their investigation." A young couple walked past, their laughter carrying across the park. Old Tom waited until they were out of earshot before continuing. "Tell me about the lead agent. What was his name?" "Special Agent Robert Morrison, young, maybe 35. Ambitious. He spoke like a man who sees this case as his ticket to bigger things." Old Tom felt a sudden pang of recognition. "Morrison. Any relation to Detective Patrick Morrison?" I don't know. Why would that matter? Patrick Morrison has been feeding me information about police investigations for 15 years. If Special Agent Morrison is his brother, or cousin, this situation becomes considerably more complex." Old Tom stood and walked to the pond's edge, his mind working through the implications. Family connections in law enforcement created vulnerabilities on both sides. A corrupt detective might be motivated to protect a federal agent relative, or conversely, might be willing to betray that relative to preserve his own position. "Harrison, I want you to go back to the federal agents. Tell them you need more time to consider their offer." "How much more time?" "Enough for me to understand what we're really facing. The federal government doesn't send agents to Chicago without specific intelligence suggesting major prosecutions are possible. Someone has been talking to them, providing information about operations that should be invisible to outsiders." Judge Blackwood stood, his relief evident. "You have a plan." "I always have a plan. Sometimes I have several, depending on which way the wind blows." Old Tom turned back toward the judge. "But I need you to do something for me. When you meet with Agent Morrison again, I want you to mention that you're concerned about potential violence if word of federal investigations becomes public. Gauge his reaction. What am I looking for? Whether he already knows about last night's incident at Murphy's Tavern. If federal agents are monitoring Mickey Flanagan closely enough to know about confrontations in neighborhood bars, it means their surveillance is far more extensive than we've assumed. They parted ways near the park entrance, Blackwood heading toward the courthouse while Old Tom made his way through the city's bustling streets. Chicago in 1925 hummed with prosperity despite Prohibition's restrictions. Construction cranes dotted the skyline, department stores displayed the latest fashions from New York and Paris, and the elevated trains carried workers to factories that operated around the clock. But beneath the city's confident exterior, Old Tom detected the subtle signs of change that most citizens missed. Federal agents asking questions, politicians suddenly reluctant to take meetings, business owners nervously reviewing their books. The comfortable corruption that had defined Chicago for decades was under assault from forces beyond the city's traditional power brokers. Old Tom's afternoon was spent making discreet inquiries through his network. A telephone operator confirmed that several long-distance calls had been placed from federal offices to Washington in recent weeks. A clerk at the First National Bank reported unusual scrutiny of certain accounts by government auditors. Most tellingly, a secretary in the mayor's office mentioned that several scheduled meetings with prominent businessmen had been quietly canceled. By evening, Old Tom had assembled a disturbing picture. The federal investigation wasn't targeting specific crimes or individuals. It was systematic, comprehensive, designed to map Chicago's entire informal power structure. Someone in Washington had decided that the city's traditional arrangements were incompatible with federal law, and they'd committed significant resources to ending those arrangements permanently. Old Tom returned to his apartment as darkness settled over the city. Margaret had left dinner warming on the stove and a pile of afternoon messages on his desk. Among them was a note that made him pause. Mickey Flanagan requests private meeting. Says it's about mutual concerns regarding federal interest in local business practices. Old Tom smiled grimly. Young Mickey might be learning faster than expected. Nothing motivated rapid education like the prospect of federal prosecution. He poured himself a whiskey and settled into his reading chair. Outside, Chicago sparkled with electric lights and neon signs, a city that had grown from frontier settlement to industrial powerhouse in barely 50 years. But beneath the lights, in the shadows between buildings and the quiet spaces where real business was conducted, the old order was ending. The question now was whether Old Tom McKenna, who had spent 4 decades building and maintaining that order, would adapt quickly enough to survive its destruction. The warehouse on Goose Island sat like a forgotten monument to Chicago's industrial ambitions, its brick walls blackened by decades of coal smoke and neglect. Old Tom arrived as the sun set behind the city's skyline, painting the Chicago River in shades of copper and gold. This was neutral ground, a place where conversations could occur without the complications of territorial pride or family loyalties. Mickey Flanagan was already waiting inside, his nervous energy evident in the way he paced between towering stacks of shipping crates. The young Irish gangster had traded his usual flashy attire for a simple dark coat and cap, recognizing instinctively that their meeting required discretion above all else. Mr. McKenna. Mickey's greeting carried a respect that had been entirely absent 3 nights earlier. Thank you for coming. Old Tom studied the younger man carefully. Fear was a powerful teacher, but it could also make people unpredictable. Mickey's hands remained visible, his posture open, suggesting genuine interest in negotiation rather than confrontation. You mentioned federal interest in local business practices. That's a delicate subject. Delicate doesn't begin to cover it. Mickey pulled a cigarette from his coat pocket, his hands shaking slightly as he lit it. I've got word that federal agents have been asking questions about dock operations, specifically about merchandise that goes missing from manifests. And what merchandise might that be? Mickey's laugh held no humor. Come on, Mr. McKenna. We both know what moves through those docks. Canadian whiskey, Irish wool with bottles sewn into the lining, cases of medical alcohol that somehow never make it to hospitals. Old Tom nodded. Prohibition had turned Chicago's ports into the gateway for half the illegal alcohol consumed in the American Midwest. The operation required cooperation from dock workers, customs officials, police, and judges, exactly the kind of widespread corruption that federal investigators found irresistible. How much do they know? Enough to put me away for 20 years. Enough to destroy everyone who's ever taken a dollar from our operations. Mickey dropped his cigarette and ground it under his heel. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. They know things they shouldn't know. Details about conversations I've only had with 3 people. Information about bank accounts that only my accountant should know about. You think someone close to you is talking. I think someone very close to all of us is talking. Mickey met old Tom's eyes directly. Someone who knows about dock operations, police payments, judicial arrangements. Someone who's been watching our business for years. Old Tom felt the familiar cold settling in his chest. In 4 decades of managing Chicago's hidden economy, he'd survived by maintaining absolute control over information flow. The possibility that someone in his inner circle had been feeding intelligence to federal agents represented a threat to everything he'd built. What do you want from me? I want to survive this. My father came to Chicago with nothing, worked himself to death building something for his family. I'm not going to let federal agents destroy that because some bastard decided to sell us out for immunity or money. The passion in Mickey's voice reminded old Tom of his younger self, full of righteous anger and unwavering determination. But passion without wisdom was dangerous, especially when federal agents were involved. Survival requires patience, Mickey. The first rule of dealing with federal investigations is that desperation leads to mistakes, and mistakes lead to prison cells. Easy words for someone who's been untouchable for 40 years. Old Tom's smile was sharp as winter ice. Untouchable? Son, I've survived 3 different federal investigations, 2 reform mayors, a world war, and the Spanish flu pandemic. I've watched men who thought themselves untouchable die in prison cells or unmarked graves. Survival isn't about being untouchable. It's about being invisible until you choose not to be. The warehouse fell quiet, except for the distant sound of ships moving along the river. Old Tom walked to a grimy window overlooking the water, watching cargo vessels navigate toward the lake. Each ship represented thousands of dollars in legitimate commerce and hidden profits, a system that had evolved over decades to serve the needs of everyone involved. "And tell me about your accountant," Old Tom said finally. "Samuel Goldberg, been with us for 3 years, handles the books for 5 different operations. Family, wife and 2 children, lives in a nice house in Rogers Park, sends his kids to private school, never been in trouble, never asked questions about where the money comes from. 3 years ago, federal agents would have had no reason to investigate Chicago specifically. Something changed, something that drew their attention to our operations." Old Tom turned back toward Mickey. "I think your Mr. Goldberg might have attracted notice for reasons having nothing to do with us." "What do you mean?" "Tax evasion, money laundering. The federal government has new tools for tracking financial transactions, and they're very interested in accountants who handle large cash transactions without proper documentation." Mickey's face paled as he grasped the implications. "You think they got to Goldberg first, then used him to understand our operations? I think Samuel Goldberg is probably sitting in a federal office right now, explaining exactly how money moves from Canadian suppliers through Chicago docks to speakeasies across the Midwest." Old Tom retrieved his pocket watch, noting the late hour. "The question is whether he's doing it voluntarily or under duress. Does it matter? It matters enormously. A willing informant might fabricate details to increase his value to investigators. A reluctant informant might provide only the minimum information necessary to satisfy his handlers." Old Tom made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. "I'm going to need you to arrange a meeting with Mr. Goldberg. Somewhere private. Somewhere we can have an honest conversation about his recent discussions with federal agents. And if he refuses, then we'll know he's made his choice, and we'll proceed accordingly." Mickey nodded grimly. Both men understood what proceeding accordingly meant in their world. "There's something else," Mickey said. "Word is that Judge Blackwood has been having private meetings with federal agents. If they've turned him, Judge Blackwood is my concern, not yours." Old Tom's tone carried a warning. "Your job is to handle the Goldberg situation quietly and efficiently. No violence, no threats, just a conversation between businessmen about mutual interests." As they prepared to leave the warehouse, Old Tom placed a hand on Mickey's shoulder. "Mickey, understand something. This investigation threatens everyone who's built their life around Chicago's traditional arrangements. but it also creates opportunities for those smart enough to recognize them. The federal government can't arrest the entire city, and they can't change human nature. There will always be demand for services that law doesn't officially recognize. You're talking about starting over. I'm talking about evolution. The methods change, but the underlying needs remain constant. Smart operators adapt their techniques while maintaining their core business principles. Mickey smiled for the first time since entering the warehouse. My father always said you were the smartest man in Chicago. Your father was a wise man. He understood that intelligence without character is just clever criminality, while character without intelligence is just noble failure. Old Tom adjusted his worn fedora. The trick is maintaining both when everyone around you is losing their minds. As they walked toward the warehouse exit, Old Tom's mind was already working through the complex chess game federal agents had initiated. Samuel Goldberg represented one piece, Judge Blackwood another. But the real question was identifying the federal strategy's ultimate objective. Were they simply collecting evidence for prosecutions, or were they planning something more comprehensive? And most importantly, did they understand that destroying Chicago's informal power structure would create a vacuum that someone else would inevitably fill? Old Tom McKenna had spent 4 decades ensuring he was always that someone else. The federal investigation might force him to change his methods, but it wouldn't change his fundamental purpose: maintaining order in a city that thrived on controlled chaos. 3 days later, Samuel Goldberg sat across from Old Tom in a private dining room above Rossetti's Italian restaurant, his hands trembling as he attempted to cut his veal. The accountant was a thin man in his 40s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the pallid complexion of someone who spent too much time reviewing ledger books by lamplight. His wife believed he was attending a business dinner with potential clients. She had no idea her husband was negotiating for his life. Mr. Goldberg, you seem nervous, Old Tom observed, his own meal untouched. Perhaps the federal agents didn't prepare you adequately for this conversation. Goldberg's fork clattered against his plate. I don't know what you're talking about. Samuel, may I call you Samuel? I've been managing delicate situations in this city since before you were born. I recognize the signs of a man who's been compromised by federal investigators. The question isn't whether you've been talking to them. The question is what we do about it. The accountant's resistance crumbled like a house of cards. They have everything, Mr. McKenna: bank records, transaction logs, photographs of money exchanges. They know about the dock operations, the police payments, the judicial bribes. They know because I've been documenting everything for 3 years. Old Tom felt a moment of genuine surprise. 3 years? That predates their investigation. I was skimming money. Goldberg's voice dropped to a whisper. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. I created false expense accounts, duplicate invoices, phantom payroll entries. I thought no one would notice, but someone did notice. Internal Revenue Service agents raided my office 18 months ago. They had evidence of tax evasion going back to 1922. They offered me a choice: 20 years in federal prison, or cooperation in a larger investigation of organized crime in Chicago. Old Tom leaned back in his chair, finally understanding the federal strategy. The government hadn't targeted Chicago's underworld directly. Instead, they'd discovered corruption by accident during routine tax investigations, then leveraged that discovery to build something much larger. What specifically have you told them? Everything I know. Names, dates, amounts, methods. I've been wearing recording devices to meetings for 6 months. I've photographed documents, copied correspondence, tracked money flows across multiple operations. The dining room fell silent, except for the distant sounds of the restaurant below. Old Tom processed this information while studying Goldberg's face. The accountant wasn't lying. His terror was too genuine, his confession too detailed. Samuel, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think very carefully before answering. Are you the only source of information the federal agents possess? Goldberg's eyes widened behind his spectacles. I assumed I was. They never mentioned other informants. But you don't know for certain. No, I don't know for certain. Old Tom stood and walked to the window overlooking Taylor Street. Below, Chicago's evening rush hour created its usual chaos of automobiles, streetcars, and pedestrians. The city continued its relentless motion, unaware that forces beyond its borders were preparing to reshape its fundamental character. Samuel, I'm going to make you an offer. You're going to continue cooperating with federal agents exactly as you have been. You're going to provide them with accurate information about our operations, attend their scheduled meetings, and wear their recording devices when requested. Goldberg stared in confusion. I don't understand. But you're also going to start working for me. Every question they ask, every piece of evidence they request, every operation they want you to investigate, I want to know about in advance. You want me to be a double agent? I want you to be exactly what you've always been. A man trying to protect his family by making the best choices available to him. Old Tom returned to his seat. The federal investigation is going to proceed regardless of what you or I do. But if I know their timeline and objectives, I can ensure that certain people have opportunities to make alternative arrangements. Goldberg's hands had stopped shaking. What kind of alternative arrangements? The kind that allow honest businessmen to retire quietly before their activities attract unwanted scrutiny. The kind that ensure family men like yourself don't become casualties in conflicts between federal agents and local interests. And if I refuse, Old Tom's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Samuel, you've already chosen your path. The only question now is whether you walk it with my protection or without it. The accountant understood. In Chicago's underworld, neutral positions didn't exist during open conflicts. You were either an asset or a liability, and liabilities had a tendency to disappear. What do you need me to do? Old Tom smiled, and for the first time in days, it reached his eyes. Continue being the excellent accountant you've always been. Maintain detailed records. Ask careful questions. Provide thorough documentation. The only difference is that copies of certain records will find their way to me before they reach federal hands. They spent the next hour discussing logistics, communication methods, security protocols, and contingency plans. Goldberg would continue his scheduled cooperation with federal agents while secretly providing Old Tom advance warning of their investigative priorities. As they prepared to leave, Old Tom placed an envelope on the table. There's $5,000 in there. Consider it a retainer for your additional services. I can't accept money for betraying federal agents. You're not betraying anyone. You're providing information to multiple interested parties, which is exactly what any competent accountant would do in your position. Old Tom adjusted his worn coat. Samuel, understand something. The federal government sees you as a tool to be used and discarded. I see you as a valuable associate whose skills and knowledge deserve appropriate compensation. 3 blocks away from Rossetti's restaurant, Old Tom made a telephone call from a public booth outside Marshall Field's department store. The number he dialed connected him to Detective Patrick Morrison's private line. Patrick, it's Tom. We need to discuss your family situation. There was a long pause before Morrison responded. What family situation? Your brother Robert. Special Agent Robert Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I believe he's leading the investigation into Chicago's business practices. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Morrison finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. How did you find out? The same way I find out everything in this city, by paying attention to details other people ignore. Old Tom watched pedestrians hurry past the phone booth, their faces reflecting the urgency that defined Chicago's evening rush. The question is what you intend to do with this conflict of interest. There's no conflict. I'm a Chicago police detective. He's a federal agent. Our jurisdictions are completely separate. Patrick, I've known you for 15 years. You're many things, but naive isn't one of them. Your brother's investigation threatens every arrangement that's kept this city's violence within manageable bounds. When federal agents start making arrests, the resulting power vacuum will make the gang wars of 1920 look like a church social. Morrison's sigh carried clearly through the telephone line. What do you want from me? Information. I want to know the scope of Robert's investigation, his timeline for major arrests, and most importantly, whether he has other sources of intelligence beyond Samuel Goldberg. And in exchange, I ensure that when the dust settles, Chicago still has functioning police department and you still have a career. Federal investigations are temporary, Patrick. They generate headlines, secure promotions for ambitious agents, and then move on to other cities. But the people who live here have to deal with the consequences long after the federal agents return to Washington. Old Tom ended the call and walked toward his apartment, his mind already moving to the next phase of his plan. The federal investigation was like a forest fire, destructive but ultimately predictable in its patterns. The key was understanding which trees could be saved and which needed to be sacrificed to protect the larger ecosystem. Back in his apartment, Margaret was waiting with the evening reports. Her expression told him the news wasn't encouraging. Judge Blackwood met with federal agents again this afternoon. Our contact in the courthouse says he emerged with recording equipment concealed in his robes. How sophisticated is the equipment? Wire recording device, probably German manufacture. High quality, nearly undetectable unless you know what to look for. Old Tom nodded grimly. The federal government's willingness to invest in expensive surveillance equipment indicated they viewed Chicago as more than a routine corruption case. Someone in Washington had decided that the city's traditional power structure represented a threat to federal authority that required comprehensive dismantling. What about Mickey Flanagan? He's been asking questions about Samuel Goldberg's family. I think he's considering more direct solutions to the information leak. Send word to Mickey immediately. No violence against Goldberg or his family. If he needs additional motivation, remind him that federal agents become very interested in anyone who harms their informants. Margaret made notes in her ever-present notebook. There's been another development. Vincent Castellano received visitors this afternoon. 3 men from New York, expensive clothes, expensive automobiles. Old Tom felt the familiar cold settling in his chest. Outside involvement changed everything. New York's crime families had resources and connections that dwarfed anything Chicago's local operators could marshal. If they'd decided the federal investigation threatened their interests, do we know what they discussed? Our contact at the Palmer House says they reserved a private dining room for 3 hours. No outside service, no interruptions. Whatever they talked about, they wanted absolute privacy. Old Tom walked to his wall map of Chicago, studying the colored pins that marked territories, operations, and spheres of influence. 40 years of careful construction could be destroyed in weeks if federal pressure combined with outside interference to destabilize the city's delicate balance of power. But crisis also created opportunity. The federal investigation might eliminate his competitors while leaving him positioned to rebuild from a stronger foundation. The key was surviving the immediate storm while positioning himself for the inevitable reconstruction. Margaret, I want you to prepare 3 different sets of documents: financial records, property deeds, and business licenses under names the federal agents haven't connected to our operations. Alternative identities, insurance policies. If Chicago becomes too dangerous for Thomas McKenna, perhaps it's time for him to retire and let someone else continue his work. She nodded with the understanding that came from 2 decades of managing Old Tom's most sensitive business. Margaret had helped him survive the gang wars, the reform movements, and the federal investigations of previous years. She understood that adaptation wasn't surrender. It was the highest form of strategic thinking. The telephone rang, interrupting their planning session. Margaret answered with her usual professionalism before covering the mouthpiece. Mickey Flanagan. He says it's urgent. Old Tom accepted the receiver. Mickey, what's happened? They killed Goldberg. Mickey's voice carried shock and anger in equal measure. Found him in his automobile outside his house 2 hours ago. Single gunshot to the head. Very professional. Old Tom closed his eyes, feeling pieces of his carefully constructed plan crumbling like old masonry. Do the police have any leads? They're calling it a robbery gone wrong, but his wallet and watch weren't touched. This was an execution, Mr. McKenna. Someone wanted to silence him permanently. Mickey, listen carefully. Where are you calling from? Public telephone outside St. Alphonsus Church. Go home immediately. Don't stop anywhere, don't talk to anyone, don't make any other calls. The federal agents are going to assume we killed Goldberg to prevent him from testifying. They'll be making arrests within hours. What about you? Old Tom looked around his apartment, at the filing cabinets full of records, the maps covered with decades of carefully plotted information, the telephone that had connected him to every significant decision made in Chicago for 20 years. I'm going to disappear for a while. When the storm passes, we'll reassess our options. After ending the call, Old Tom began systematically destroying the most sensitive documents while Margaret packed essential items into 2 leather suitcases. They worked in silence, both understanding that an era was ending. The comfortable arrangements that had governed Chicago for decades were being swept away by forces beyond their control. But old Tom McKenna hadn't survived 4 decades in Chicago's underworld by accepting defeat. He'd survived by reading situations correctly, adapting quickly, and always maintaining alternative plans. As sirens wailed in the distance, probably federal agents and police converging on addresses throughout the city, old Tom put on his worn brown coat and battered fedora one last time. To casual observers, he still looked like nothing more than an elderly man heading out for an evening walk. But appearances, as he'd learned long ago, were the most reliable form of deception. The old hatted man they'd laughed at 3 nights ago was about to demonstrate why he'd been giving orders in Chicago since before most of them were born. The game wasn't over. It was simply time for the next hand to be dealt. 6 months later, federal prosecutors would celebrate convictions against 17 Chicago criminals, including Mickey Flanagan and Judge Harrison Blackwood. The newspapers would hail it as the end of organized crime in the city. Danny Sullivan, the dock worker whose confrontation had started everything, used Mickey's $500 payment to move his family to Detroit, where his sick daughter recovered in cleaner air, and his union connections secured him steady work far from federal investigations. Detective Patrick Morrison received a commendation for his cooperation in the federal investigation, though he never revealed the full extent of his brother Robert's requests for local intelligence. Some secrets, both brothers agreed, were better left buried with the old Chicago. But in a modest office above a bakery on Halsted Street, a man calling himself Thomas Mitchell hung a new map of Chicago on his wall. The colored pins were fewer now, the territories smaller, but the fundamental understanding remained unchanged. Thomas Mitchell opened a leather notebook, newer than the one Thomas McKenna had carried but serving the same purpose, and began recording names, addresses, and the small corruptions that would, with patience and careful attention, grow into something larger. The old hatted man was dead. Long live the old hatted man.